Hey guys, I have a really cool demo for you today. Clip Studio Paint reached out and asked me to try out their new update that lets you convert Photoshop brushes into Clip Studio Paint brushes automatically. And this was super interesting to me, of course, because I have spent many hours taking my Photoshop brush packs and converting them into Clip Studio brush packs manually. So I'm really excited to give you guys a preview of my next brush pack, show you how they work in Photoshop, and then convert them automatically into Clip Studio Paint brushes and paint with them there. Hey guys, so before we jump into converting the brushes into Clip Studio brushes, let me run through a preview of my next brush set here in Photoshop and show you how the brushes are working in Photoshop, and that way we can kind of compare it to the way that they work in Clip Studio. So I'm gonna head down here. Here is the selection of brushes that I'm going to use for this little demo. These are all work in progress brushes, so there's no guarantee that they will work exactly the same in the final pack, but I am going to use them here to just kind of demo for the example. So here, let's actually make this background a bit darker, something like that, and let me run through each of these. So we've got some daisies. Then we've got clustered daisies. Got some of these kind of bell type flowers. And some more of these. Just getting some different arrangements of these kind of bell type flowers. Then we've got this type of flower. Some more grass. And then some various plant stalks. So the first thing that we need to do is I'm going to select this folder here. This folder has all the brushes that I'm going to take into Clip Studio. I'm going to grab that folder, and then I'm going to go up to this little gear here and say export selected brushes. So I'll call them Clip Studio Paint demo brushes, save them. Now we can come over here into Clip Studio, and if I click on these three lines, I can say import subtool, and then go here, grab them and say open, and now it's made me a little folder with these Clip Studio Paint brushes. So next, let's just see if they function the same way here in Clip Studio Paint as they were functioning in Photoshop. So first we've got these daisies. Let me give us a nice backdrop. So we've got these daisies. Alright, so I can see that the first problem we've got here is that it looks like we can't make the daisies any bigger based on the brush size. And I know why this is happening. And this is because the way that Clip Studio Paint is scattering this brush is it's making use of this particle effect, which doesn't let us make the flowers bigger and smaller depending on how big our brush is. Whereas I'm guessing that this brush here, this one does let us make the flowers bigger and smaller depending on our brush size. So these two Photoshop brushes are set up different ways. And the way that they're set up in Photoshop is affecting the way that they import into Clip Studio Paint. So if I go back into Photoshop here, if I select this brush and go in here, yeah, it looks like it's got some scattering on. And if I click this one, it has no scattering. Do you see this little setting here, this scatter setting? So this brush, it still is kind of scattering them a little bit, just using the spacing here, but it's not actually using the scatter effect. So we want this brush to function more like this brush over in Clip Studio. So if I go back here and go into this brush, I'm gonna open up the Subtool Detail panel here. So this brush has a spraying effect going on. So I'm gonna turn off the spraying effect. I don't want it to have a spraying effect. Instead, I just want the brush itself to kind of scatter. So if I go into this brush here, we can see that it's just kind of scattering by using this, you know, this stroke. We just added some gap space to the stroke. So let's do the same thing here, and great. Now this brush, rather than staying really tiny, we can actually make it bigger like that. So I'm gonna take that down a little bit. So now we can make this flower bigger as it gets like closer to the camera, for example. So that was a pretty easy fix, but important to kind of take note of. And I imagine that there's going to be little differences like that for various different brushes. Yeah, I've heard that dual brushes aren't going to work, and the mixer brush also isn't going to work. So there are some tools that just aren't going to be able to convert over very well, but if you're having an issue with the scattering effect, then it looks like that is going to be able to solve it. Hey guys, just popping in to add a little note. I talked to Clip Studio Paint about the spray particle effect and how brushes with the particle effect weren't responsive to brush size. And they pointed out to me that you actually can change the particle size here using this slider. So if you want to keep the spraying effect and just change your particle size using this little meter right here, that's totally an option too. Either method will work. Another thing we can do is if we come over into this brush size, I can add a little bit of randomness to this to make the flowers appear bigger and smaller as I go along in a stroke. So it's over here under brush size. If I then click on this here and click random, I can add some randomness, and I want to bring the minimum value up a little bit. I don't want the brush to get super tiny, but now you can see that we get some bigger flowers and some smaller flowers, and it looks a little bit more random. And that is another setting that looks like it didn't really transfer over from Photoshop, but that's okay. We can add that in. So we've got this first little daisy brush that's functioning quite good now. We've got this second daisy brush also functioning quite good. Then let's check out these little like bell type flowers. Looks like that is actually working quite well. And it gets bigger and smaller. It's good. It doesn't have the kind of like particle spraying effect on. Let's see. This one also seems to be working quite well. Let's see though. Yeah, this one has the particle spray effect on, which again, we don't want that. So I'm going to turn that off. And looks like we're going to need to go here to the stroke again and add some spacing. And then if I click on this, I can add a little bit of randomness to the spacing so that it's not always exactly the same distance apart between the flowers. And then let's add some randomness to the brush size too. And that feels a little more natural now. This looks like it's functioning quite well. Let's add some randomness. Oh, it's actually, this one has got some randomness, so that's good. It might just be pulling that from whether or not the Photoshop brush has it. So that's great in that case, if it is doing that. Then we've got these flowers. Will they get bigger and smaller? No, they won't. So let's turn the spraying effect off here and go into the stroke. Add some more spacing and make the spacing a little bit random. If I go into brush tip, I can also make the angle a bit random like that. So this is, you can see now the angle of the flower is not always going to be exactly the same. So I went over into brush tip and I added some randomness here for the angle. So that is going to make it appear a little more natural. And then we can do that same thing again for the brush size. And again, maybe not make it get super tiny, but have it have a little bit of variation. Great, now that's working properly, awesome. See if the grass is working. Looks like the grass is working just fine. Don't even think we need to edit that, that's great. And then we've got these wildflower stems. Looks like that's also working really well. No issues there. Got some grass. Seems to be working just fine. And some more wild plants. And this is also working just fine. Awesome. Last two couple of plants. It's responsive to size, that's perfect. And last one here. Also responsive. This is great. So this is a huge life upgrade, a huge quality of life upgrade. The main reason, I know that some of them aren't coming in perfectly and I'm having to make some adjustments, but the process of how long it would take to import brushes before this, it was super long because I would have to open up the PNG files for the brush tips. So, you know, the stamp that one of these brushes would be made out of, I would have to export just the PNG of that brush tip stamp into Clip Studio, select it, register it as a material, then create a new brush, add that material to the brush tip, and then make all of the setting changes. And that was a pretty long process. So the fact that this cuts out just, you know, setting up the majority of each brush and getting that brush tip in there and registered as a material, like the fact that it does that for me is really great. It's going to take so much less time for me to move my brushes between Photoshop and Clip Studio and get my Clip Studio packs out. Like, I think from now on I'll be able to release the Clip Studio brushes at the same time as the Photoshop ones, because rather than taking like 4 or 5 hours for me to go through and register, you know, each tip material and name each brush and do the settings, I'll be able to just import them. They'll already be named. They already will have the right brush tips in there, and then I'll just need to make some changes. And yeah, I don't know that it's going to work for everything. There are still some brush settings that just aren't the same between Clip Studio and Photoshop. And if anyone has used one of my foliage brush packs in the past, or if you've used both the Photoshop and the Clip Studio versions of it, you'll know that there are just some differences. So there isn't a perfect one-to-one between the brush engines, but this should be able to get us as far as is possible. And for the type of brushes that I make, this is gonna be just fine. You know, the type of brushes that I make are actually pretty easy to convert. Not easy, they're pretty feasible to convert. Like, it's pretty possible to make versions of them that works in both programs because they're not reliant on like the dual brush setting or texture settings or the mixer brush. They're pretty like basic. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to doing this from now on, and this should really expedite the process of moving brushes in between programs. I would say that in order to do this like well yourself, if you're new to converting brushes, I would definitely recommend getting familiar with both the Photoshop brush panel and the Clip Studio brush panel, and that can take some time. It's definitely not, you know, super easy, and I would love to do more videos that go a bit more into depth on the two brush panels, just because I've gotten pretty used to them over time. So if that's something you'd be interested in, let me know. There are some tutorials on YouTube that kind of walk you through the basic settings already, so maybe watch those and just get a little bit familiar with it. My kind of top recommendations for someone who is new to adjusting brushes in Clip Studio is to definitely play around with these little settings here. I didn't even know that this existed when I was first building brushes in Clip Studio. This lets you add like randomness. It lets you jitter, different effects. It lets you make the size bigger and smaller, and add randomness to how big things are. And that's super important. It lets you you can vary the thickness by randomness or the angle. Like, these settings are very important. You can also, here, this is where you can change the angle of a brush based on the direction that you're drawing in. So, the direction of the line that you're making, we want it to follow our brush like that so that we can make plants like this, right? So that's where you find that setting. So play around with these settings here. You want to click on these little buttons, figure out what they do, turn them off and on, be creative, really try to learn and see what each setting does, and it's going to give you a much easier time when you're going into brushes and editing them. So awesome. Let's just do a little demo now. Alright, so getting going on this demo, I laid in a pretty basic field, and now I'm using that new grass brush that I made to brush some grass detail over top. I'm gonna just make a nice, charming little wildflower field with these brushes, since there's not a ton of variation in them, but I think that we can come up with some, different colored flowers and some fun little plants and just make it a nice field. So after I set up the original kind of grass areas, I'm going in with some of the more detail-oriented grass and plant brushes to make it look kind of overgrown and wild. I really like for my fields to have a lot of biodiversity and feel like there's a lot of different plants. I'm really glad that I was able to get these brushes to be responsive to the size. That's super important to me, and if you're going in and editing brushes, definitely try to get them to be responsive to the size of your brush, so that when you increase or decrease the size of your brush, you can make, especially for something like flowers, we can make the flowers bigger or smaller. The reason that I turned off that particle effect and switched to a different method of scattering is so that as the ground comes toward us in this field, we can make the flowers bigger and the plants bigger. We want them to get bigger, and I want an easy way to do that. I want to be able to make bigger plants, bigger flowers as they come toward us, because in perspective, they're going to be getting bigger, they're closer to us, they're closer to our eyes, our camera that we are, quote unquote, taking this picture with, if we're thinking about it in that sense. So really glad that I was able to get them responsive to size. And little tip, if you're exporting brushes in Photoshop, maybe turn off the scatter effects and export them without the scatter effects, so that it doesn't come in with the particle effect. And then you would have a little bit, fewer steps in getting these brushes to function the way that I ended up getting them to. For brushes that have to do with wild things, wilderness, any type of plants or nature, randomness is always really important. Getting it to look, more wild and organic and less, digital and, regular is really important. So I'm always thinking about, what settings I can push to make the angle change on its own, to make the color change on its own. All of those settings are really important in order to get, nature brushes to function well. So going into the panel and adjusting the distance and making that a little bit more random, making the angle more random, those settings are all super important, and they all play into this kind of scene a lot. I want each area of it to feel unique and to feel organic, and the randomness is really important for getting that effect. Beyond this point, I'm really just putting some final little paint touches onto this little demo here, messing around with it, trying to make it look nice and pretty to get a fun concept. And I'm going to just play out the music from here, because not much else has to do with the topic at hand, but definitely feel free to stick around and watch the rest of this little painting demo. Thank you so much for watching, and a huge thanks to Clip Studio Paint for sponsoring this video. If you tried out the new update, let me know how it went for you in the comments.